Now that you've had an opportunity to grapple with your partner, let's take a look at some of the outcomes that you came up with and talk about why those might be. So in the first situation, when we were asking about an even plus an even, you likely came out with the answer would also, or the result would also be even. So if we took a look at an example of why that's going to be, if we have 4 plus 6, for example, I'm just going to do 4 little dots, and then I'm going to have 6 little dots. Well, one thing you might remember is that if something is even, then it is divisible by 2. That also means that we can create some groups of 2. So if I start creating some pairs here, well, I ran out. Oh, but I've got these 2 right here. So what we just created was pairs, which is also a way of demonstrating that this outcome, or this result, is divisible by 2. So you should have something on your paper that's similar that is proving why we're going to end up with an even result. So feel free to pause the video and get that written down on your paper. The next piece that we are going to look at is when we have an odd plus an odd, what that outcome would be. So let's take a look at an example of 3 plus 5. So I'm just going to use my dots just to kind of create a visual model, because we don't want to just be able to answer it, we also want to be able to explain why. So if we take a look at 3 plus 5, again, using that idea of a number is even if it's divisible by 2, I can start creating some 2's or some pairs. And here's the other 2. So we would see, we know that the answer is 8. I know you know that. But our outcome, our result, is an even because we ended up pairing up those odd values together, and it ended up creating something that was divisible by 2. They were all able to find a pair. Again, go ahead and pause the video so that way you can get that written down as well. Next up, we are going to take a look at the last piece, which is asking you about an odd and an even and determining the sum of what that would include. So if we were to take a look at an example for that one, I'm going to do 3 plus 2. So I'm going to do 3 little dots and 2 little dots. So what we're going to notice is that our even is going to have a pair with the odd. But our odd is going to have one extra unit that cannot be divisible by 2. So therefore, our result, when we add an odd plus an even, it is going to also stay odd, or an even plus an odd will be odd, because of this little extra unit that came from the odd number. So go ahead and pause. Feel free to get whatever you need written down on your grapple. And as soon as you're ready, go ahead and start the video again and turn your page to the back side where we're going to be looking at products. So now that we're going to be looking at some multiplication work, the very first thing that you're asked to do is to determine the result of multiplying an even times an even. I used a little dot here to represent multiplication. Some of you might not have seen this before, but it means to multiply. And one of the reasons why we might use a dot instead of the X is, don't write this down, but if I were to write even times even, you might see that that looks like even x even. It kind of looks like a word as opposed to a multiplication sign. So oftentimes, especially when we're using letters, in math, we will use the dot to represent multiplication so you don't confuse it with the letter X. All right, so a quick reminder. Yesterday you guys all talked about the fact that division is splitting. Multiplication is making copies. And this is true whether you have whole numbers, fractions, decimals, all of those are examples of making copies. So if we think about what an example might look like for this, if I have 8 times 6, then I can think of that as 8 copies of 6. So if I were to draw a visual of that, I'm going to make 8 groups, 2, 3, so 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And ideally, I would put 6 dots in each. I've got kind of a small room to work. 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm sure your model is going to look a lot better than mine. That's your challenge. Try to create a model that looks more understandable than what I have. Okay, so you might already be using your background knowledge. 8 times 6 is 48, which is an even number. But why? I'm going to have you pause the video and I'd like you to talk to your partner about why did this end up being an even? Think back to what we know about adding and feel free to use the model to help you. So one thing that we can see in this model is that I am making copies of 6. I have 6, 6, 6, and we know that repeated addition and multiplication are the same. So really, we're adding 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6, which means we're adding an even plus an even. And what we know from our work with sums is that an even plus an even would result in an even, which also tells us that if I'm repeating an even number over and over and over again, my result will also be even. Go ahead and pause the video, get that written down. The next part of your grapple asks you about an odd times an odd. Remember, I'm using that dot as my symbol. So if we were to think about an example of an odd times an odd, let's just take 5 times 3 for a moment. I can also think about that as 5 copies of 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Aw, these are weird looking, they look like faces, but kind of weird looking. So if we have 5 times 3, you know the outcome is 15, which is odd. And I don't mean strange odd. I mean that it is an odd number. So if we're thinking about why that is, if we were to take, let me use a different color here. If we were to take an even number of groups, so let's say 2 times 3, that would be even. 2 times 3, that would be even. But look at this extra little group at the end. Go ahead and pause the video. How would that extra group make this an odd result? So I hope that what you discussed is that an extra group of odd is going to make our final result odd. All of these odd and all of these even number of odd groups. So here's 2 groups, here's 4 groups. I know you can't really see that very well, but those are even numbers. But now I have a 5th copy, I have a 5th group, which means I might have had even, but as soon as I have this extra group of an odd number, my result is going to end up being odd. Go ahead and write that down, and we'll do our last piece from your grapple. All right, the final one that you need to be able to explain is when we have an odd times an even. So I'm going to take my example of what we had before of our 8 times 6, and I'm going to change it to 3 times 6. So if I were to draw 3 copies of 6, I'm just going to write in the number 6. Not really a visual model, but for the sake of time, I'm going to draw in the 6s. So I know 3 times 6 is 18. Okay, but I have an odd number, so shouldn't that make our result odd? Well, no, because this is also repeated addition of I'm repeating a 6. Think about what we know with addition. An even plus an even makes an even result. So if I am doing 6 plus another 6 plus another 6, I am repeatedly adding an even number, or I'm copying an even number, so my result will be even. So while you're doing your problem set today, you're welcome to use the Grapple Notes. That's a great resource. And your substitute will be talking to you next about how to use an answer key to get smarter. Be good for this sub. Should be seeing you tomorrow.